We're going to take a look now at journalism and language, a few terms in particular. Journalists are supposed to choose their words carefully, and most news organizations have books that spell out the do's and don'ts of terminology, what kind of language to use when dealing with contentious topics, and what terms to avoid. Over the past month, the world's largest news agency, the Associated Press, has made two significant changes to its style book. Out goes the term illegal to describe certain kinds of immigrants. And the AP also has new rules on how to use the word Islamist. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on changing terminology in the news business and the importance of words.
Words can inform, but they can also inflame. The news business is a minefield of controversial terminology, and last month, the news agency The Associated Press called time on one phrase: illegal immigrants. The reason given: the word illegal should not be used to describe a person. Illegal, according to the AP, should only describe an action, such as living in a country illegally. It was a victory for Latino advocacy groups who have long said the term is offensive.
The debate about immigration in the United States has changed dramatically. People have an appreciation for the value that immigrants, particularly Latino immigrants, have to the American economy, to American society, and so that explains why we are now more willing or more likely to have some kind of immigration reform legislation go through the Congress. And the AP style book is often just a reflection of changing public attitudes about an issue or a cultural change in America, and so it's a catching up, if you will.
After illegal immigrant was dropped from the AP style book, you saw the New York Times and now the Los Angeles Times following suit. And so this really shows the influence of that kind of change on the rest of print media.
AP Style Guide is among the most influential in the news business. The agency provides wire services to thousands of news organizations. That's 1,400 print outlets in the US alone and 5,000 broadcasters around the world. So when the AP makes a change, it matters. Not just for the agency, but for all who subscribe to its services and adopt its language. 2 days after changing the way it describes undocumented immigrants, the AP announced it would be revising its use of the term Islamist. The stylebook entry now reads: an advocate or supporter of a political movement that favors reordering government and society in accordance with laws prescribed by Islam. Do not use as a synonym for Islamic fighters, militants, extremists, or radicals who may or may not be Islamists.
What we're seeing post 9/11 and across our time in a globalizing planet is more sensitivity to what words mean and to the implications the terminology has. And the term Islamist is, I don't know what that means. Is that somebody who believes in Islam?
Protests by Islamists.
Is that somebody who believes fervently in Islam?
Black flags, the Islamists.
Is that an extremist? Is that a terrorist? And that's the problem with that term. This word doesn't make sense. It's almost a racist word. And if it were used in conjunction with another religion, I'm not sure what the word would be, but it would be subject of ridicule and huge debate, because does it mean that someone who is a dedicated Christian or a dedicated Jew is by definition radicalized? No.
Just after 9/11, news organizations were already changing their use of language. Reuters issued an internal memo about the use of the word terrorist. The news agency ruled that the word was only to be used if accompanied by quotation marks. After the 2005 bombings in London, the British Broadcasting Corporation issued new guidance for staff to opt for less loaded terms than terrorist, like militant or extremist.
That was one of the debates that took a long time to sort out in the BBC. It was misreported in the press, as it usually is, that we banned the word terrorism. We hadn't banned the word terrorism. What we did say was it is much better to use the word that more correctly describes the activity that we're talking about. Bombers, gunmen, fighters, insurgents, whatever the term is, and only use the word terrorist as a last resort, except where it was quite obviously that the act was an act of terror, an act deliberately calculated to terrorize the population.
Journalists reporting political events have to be careful because the stories they report are already framed by the language used by those in positions of power, be it at press conferences, in official statements, sources, or even institutional names.
Countries, organizations, militaries name their defense forces, just that name, defense forces. What if a defense force goes on the offense? Is it still a defense force?
If Israel calls its army the defense force, then for the sake of clarity and for the sake of simplicity, if nothing else, I think it's probably right to call them by that name.
At the exact moment Israeli defense forces began hitting their targets in Gaza,
we tend to call separatist movements by the name they choose for themselves. We tend to call insurgent groups by the names they choose for themselves. I think people are quite used to this, and they're wise enough and sensible enough to know that if this insurgent group is calling itself this, we don't have to go along with all the adjectives it uses to describe itself.
They call themselves the Free Syrian Army.
They name military operations, Operation Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, or whatever it's going to be.
The start of the campaign called Shock and Awe.
So these are loaded terms. They are often going to reinforce the meaning that its authors, meaning governments, give them, and therefore, almost by definition, they become propaganda. Everybody does it. So what do you do as a news organization? Some of these things you can get around. You can refer to the Israeli military. You can refer to the war in Iraq.
Al Jazeera's style book has addressed all these words. Terrorism, Israeli Defense Force, Islamist, war on terror. You won't see any of these on the auto cue. But in the world of 24-hour news, increasingly driven by digital content, are style guides still as influential as they once were? Social media and citizen journalism are undermining traditional news institutions, using new technology and introducing random, chaotic elements to the news discourse that no style guide, however well considered, can possibly contain.
Journalism is now in the middle of some very dramatic changes in which anybody can declare themselves to be a journalist, can start a blog, can start a social media site, and that's terrific. You know, it widens the debate.
There can be these editorial guidelines that give clear rules about the use of problematic terms like terrorism. But it's when you get into a breaking news situation and you have cable news filling up its 24-hour news cycle with kind of talking heads and chatter, waiting for the next news update, where speculation and rumors really drive things, that you have an imprecise use of language.
This was a dark-skinned male.
These pundits and experts and presenters and journalists are just sort of talking to fill time, and they don't have their, an instant checker with the guidelines.
That's why the AP style book remains important as a source for neutral language. There's much less standardization anymore, and so words can mean anything to anybody.